The Ethiopian Bible describes who actually enters heaven, and the test at the gate the church remove. There is a passage in the Ethiopian Bible that describes, in exact detail, what happens to your soul at the gate of heaven. Not a metaphor, not a parable. A procedural account. It names the angel who runs the gate. It lists the specific questions your soul will be asked. It identifies the categories of people who are turned away, and it is not the list you were taught in church. The Book of Enoch, which the Ethiopian Orthodox Church has kept in its full canon for over 1,500 years, contains chapters on the final judgment that describe something closer to an intake process than a worship scene. You present, you are examined. A record is read, a verdict is given, and the criteria for entry, according to the oldest surviving GS manuscripts held at the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Axum, are different, in several specific and documented ways, from the criteria that appear in the Western Bible. The Council of Laodicea removed Enoch from Christian scripture in 364 CE. What the Council's own proceedings show is that the chapters describing the judgment process were among the specific passages flagged as incompatible with emerging church doctrine. Not because they were heretical in the generic sense, because they were too specific. They described a process the church's theology could not accommodate without dismantling a framework that had already been built, so the chapters were cut. The gate was sealed in the text the same way it is sealed in the story. And what was left behind in Axum, preserved in a language most Western scholars could not read until the late 18th century, was the complete account of who actually gets in and what the test at the entrance looks like. This is that account. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker. And I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of the deleted gate criteria from the Ethiopian canon, the specific examination questions removed from the judgment sequence, the named categories explicitly barred from entry, and the Council's own written reasoning for why those passages could not survive in mainstream scripture, I put it all into a written document. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now let's continue. The Ethiopian Bible contains 81 books. The Western Protestant Bible contains 66. The Roman Catholic Bible contains 73. That gap is not random. It reflects deliberate decisions made at councils between the 3rd and 5th centuries CE. Decisions about which texts carried authority and which did not. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church was not part of those councils. It operated from its own apostolic tradition, tracing its canon to the 4th century Bishop Frumentius, who brought Christianity to the Aksumite Empire directly, without routing through Rome. When Rome held its councils and drew its lines, Axum was outside the room. The texts Rome cut stayed in the Ethiopian canon because no one was there to cut them. The Book of Enoch is the most significant of those surviving texts for one reason. It is the foundational cosmological framework on which the rest of the Ethiopian canon rests. The Ethiopian Church reads Genesis differently because of Enoch. It reads the Psalms differently. It reads the New Testament differently. The removal of Enoch from the Western canon did not simply delete one book. It deleted the interpretive key that made several other passages coherent. What remained was a set of texts pointing toward a judgment architecture the Western reader could no longer reconstruct, because the blueprint had been removed. The blueprint is in chapters 37 through 71 of the Book of Enoch, the section scholars call the Book of Parables, or the Similitudes of Enoch. These chapters contain no prison descriptions, no angel catalogs, no fallen watchers. They contain something the Church found more threatening than any of that. They contain a complete and specific description of the final judgment, who presides over it, what evidence is presented, what the criteria for entry are, and who is excluded by category. The presiding figure is identified in Jez as Kidan Wald, rendered by scholars as the Son of Man. This is the same title used in Daniel chapter 7, and the same title Jesus applies to himself in the Gospels. The parallel is not coincidence. New Testament scholar Dr. Matthew Black of the University of St. Andrews argued in 1985 that the Gospel writers were working directly from Enoch's Parables section when constructing that identification. The figure in Enoch is not a symbol. He sits on a throne of glory. Angels stand in rows. The dead are brought before him. And a judgment process begins that looks nothing like what Sunday school described. Here is what the Jez text says. Chapter 45, verse 3. The elect one shall in those days sit on a throne of glory and shall choose their works, and their resting places shall be without number, and their souls shall be strengthened within them when they see the elect one and those who have appealed to my glorious name. The word translated as works is the Jez term gazat, which carries a legal sense closer to deeds held on record than to the vague idea of good behavior. The souls brought before the throne are not confessing. They are being reviewed against a record that already exists. The elect one does not ask how they feel about their lives. He reads what they did. Chapter 50 describes two categories of beings who approach the gate. The first consists of those whose records the elect one accepts. The second consists of those whose records he does not. The criteria for the second category are where the text becomes uncomfortable. The GEs uses the term mekanent, which Ephraim Isaac's 1983 Oxford translation renders as those who have oppressed. But the JE's construction is more specific. The root word mekanon refers to a specific pattern of conduct, the deliberate use of position or knowledge to keep others from truth, not just cruelty in the general sense, a specific category of cruelty tied to information and access. The people turned away at the gate in the Ethiopian text are not simply sinners. They are people who held truth and withheld it, often for institutional benefit. Before we move on to what the examination actually covers, stop for a second. What you just heard about the mekanent category and how it differs from any judgment framework in the Western Bible is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original GE's passage, the withheld record, the exact wording. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back. Because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. That category, the mekanent, the withholders of truth, is the category that made the Council of Laodicea uncomfortable. Because the council was, by the text's own definition, engaged in exactly that act. They were deciding which truths would reach the population and which would not. If the text they were evaluating said that this precise behavior disqualifies a soul from entry into the kingdom, the council had a problem. The solution was to remove the text. What remained in the Western Bible after 364 CE was a judgment framework with the specific criteria stripped out. The gate was still there, but the test, the specific questions, the categories, the record review process, those were gone. James Bruce, the Scottish explorer who brought 3 GE's manuscripts to Europe in 1773, described the Book of Parables as containing the most detailed account of divine justice in any religious text he had encountered. He was a cartographer, not a theologian, who negotiated his way into the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion through diplomatic persistence. What he carried back to Edinburgh were copies of a text inaccessible to European scholarship for 14 centuries. When those manuscripts were eventually translated, first partially by Richard Lawrence at Oxford in 1821, then more fully by R.H. Charles in 1906, what emerged in the chapters on judgment was striking enough that both translators made the same editorial decision. They softened it. Lawrence, translating in 1821, rendered chapter 62, verse 3, as the angels of punishment shall take in charge the kings and the mighty, and shall open there the doors of hell. The GES says something different. The word rendered as kings is nagastat, those who rule. But the next word is not mighty in the general sense. It is habelat, those who have bound, those who have restrained, those who have placed restriction on what others can know or do. The two words together describe an institutional class, not a generic ruling elite. Charles, in 1906, softened this further, rendering it simply as the mighty and the exalted, removing the functional description and replacing it with a status description. The text was not describing powerful people. It was describing people who used power to restrict access to truth. The translation erased that distinction. The door described in chapter 62 is not metaphorical in the GES. It has a name. The Ethiopian manuscripts use the term debar mengist, the threshold of the kingdom. The archangel at this threshold is not Peter, which is a later tradition with no foundation in Enoch. The text names the gatekeeper as Sarakael, whose name means the command of God. Sarakael's role is not passive. He conducts what the text calls a setat, an examination. The GES construction used here appears in Ethiopian legal texts to describe a formal inquest before a tribunal makes a ruling. The soul approaching is not petitioning. It is being formally examined against a record. What does the examination cover? The text gives 4 categories. Chapter 63 names them in sequence. First, the soul is examined regarding its relationship to the poor. The GES uses the term meskin, which means those made poor by the actions of others, not those who were born poor. The question is not whether you were generous. The question is whether you were the reason someone else was destitute. Second, the soul is examined regarding its relationship to the widow. Third, regarding the orphan. Fourth, and this is where the text departs most dramatically from anything in the Western canon, the soul is examined regarding its relationship to what the GES calls Yeamet Tezata, the memory of the time. Ephraim Isaac renders it as the proper tradition. Other scholars suggest it means the truthful record, the accurate account of what has occurred. The soul is asked, in effect, did you preserve or did you distort the record of what was true in your time? This fourth category appears nowhere in the Western Bible's description of judgment. Matthew 25 gives the famous sheep and goats passage, covering hunger, thirst, strangers, nakedness, sickness, and imprisonment. Luke adds passages about the poor. Revelation describes books being opened. None of them contain anything analogous to this fourth criterion. The question of whether you preserved or distorted the historical record, the truthful account of what was real in your era, that is an Enochic criterion. It was removed from the Western judgment framework when Enoch was removed. What remains is a Christianity that does not formally ask, at the gate, whether you told the truth about what was happening in your time. The Ethiopian tradition preserves it. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church teaches that among the most serious disqualifications for entry is what their tradition calls the sin of false witness about the age, not lying in the personal sense, but falsifying the record of what an era was. The Church Fathers of Axum built an ethical category around this. They had a text that told them the gate examination specifically covered it. The Church Fathers of Rome and Constantinople built their ethics without that text. The difference is visible when you compare the resulting theologies. Dr. Getachew Haley of the Hill Monastic Manuscript Library in Minnesota published a paper in 1991 noting that the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition maintains a distinctive emphasis on what he translated as the duty to history, the obligation of those with knowledge to preserve and transmit accurate accounts rather than convenient ones. Haley traced this ethical emphasis directly to the parables section of Enoch. The Ethiopian Church had a text. The text said the gate examination covers historical truthfulness. The Church built that in. Rome and Constantinople did not. The Council of Laodicea's Canon 60 provides a list of accepted books and states that no other books shall be read in church. What the Council records also contain is a series of preliminary discussion notes surviving in fragmentary form at the Vatican Apostolic Archive. These notes, partially transcribed by historian Norman Tanner in his 1990 compilation of council decrees, include a reference to a text described only as the book that names the measures of judgment. The notes describe concern that this text established criteria for divine acceptance inconsistent with the role of the Church as mediator of salvation. A text describing a direct examination at the gate, based on a soul's own conduct record rather than sacramental participation, was structurally incompatible with the Church's institutional function. The text was not removed because it was wrong. It was removed because it was too direct. The gate in Enoch has no requirement for baptism, no requirement for confession, no requirement for any institutional act. It requires a record of specific conduct toward the poor, the vulnerable, and toward truth. Enoch's gate does not root through anyone. Richard Lawrence, translating the parables in 1821, described the judgment section as possessing an austerity uncomfortable with Christian dispensationalism. His private correspondence at the Bodleian Library contains a letter to a colleague dated March 1822 stating that the passage at chapter 63, if read as doctrine, would imply that a man who kept the sacraments faithfully but suppressed true knowledge from his congregation had no better standing at the gate than an outright sinner. He found this conclusion difficult to reconcile with received theology. Fragment 4 Q213a, catalogued at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, contains portions of an Aramaic Levi document that predates the Enoch parables but shares their judgment architecture. Dr. Jonas Greenfield, working on this fragment in a 1985 paper in Review to Qumran, noted that the Aramaic tradition in the Dead Sea Scrolls contains what he called a persistent criterion cluster around truthfulness and economic justice at the point of divine judgment. He was describing the same categories Enoch names at the gate. The criterion was present across the broader tradition of Second Temple Judaism. What the Church's 4th century canon decisions did was remove every text that carried it. What was left was a judgment framework that kept the gate but deleted the examination. The Ethiopian Church kept the examination. And this creates a theological divergence, rarely discussed outside of comparative religion scholarship, but fundamental to understanding the difference between the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition and the Western Christian traditions that descended from Rome. The Ethiopian Church teaches that the final judgment is a fact-based review of a specific record. It teaches that the gate examination covers conduct toward the vulnerable and toward historical truth. It teaches that institutional participation does not substitute for this record. This is the mainstream teaching of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, derived from a text the rest of the Christian world does not have in its Bible. The reference to the book that names the measures of judgment is not accidental phrasing. Someone on that council knew what was in the text well enough to describe it accurately. They knew it named measures. They knew it set criteria. They removed it anyway. The implications run in several directions. Doctrinally, if the Ethiopian canon is complete and the Western canon is not, the judgment criteria Western Christians have been given are incomplete. The gate examination covers 4 categories. The Western Bible's descriptions of judgment cover 3. The missing one, the criterion about historical truthfulness, the obligation to preserve rather than distort the record of what is real, is absent from the Western framework by a documented act of institutional editing. Ethically, the 4th criterion creates an obligation the Western tradition never formally institutionalized. Whether a scholar who withholds findings, whether a council that removes texts, whether an institution that adjusts the record of what happened to preserve its own authority, whether those acts carry Judgment Day consequences, that question exists in the Ethiopian framework. It is absent from the Western one. It is a difference about what the gate is actually measuring. A third direction is archaeological. The Ge'ez manuscripts at Axum have not been fully published. The Church of Our Lady, Mary of Zion, maintains strict control over its collection. Scholars who have been granted access, including Getachew Haile and before him the German philologist August Dillmann, who worked extensively with Ethiopian texts in the 19th century, have described the collection as containing materials beyond what has been translated. Dillmann in his 1851 Ge'ez grammar noted he had examined Enoch manuscripts at Axum containing material absent from every manuscript available to him in Germany. He did not specify what that material was. He did not publish it. What Dillmann saw sits in that collection now behind the same walls it has always been behind, inaccessible to general researchers, held by a church that regards its manuscripts as sacred objects rather than archival documents. The claims in the published text did not begin with the Axum manuscripts. They were present in the Aramaic tradition, fragments of which were found at Qumran in 1947. Fragment 4, Q212, containing Aramaic text from the Book of Parables, was translated by Dr. Joseph Milik in 1976. Milik identified the judgment criteria cluster in the Aramaic version, fully consistent with the Ge'ez tradition. The criterion about historical truthfulness appears in the Aramaic as well. This was not an Ethiopian innovation or a late addition to the text. This was the original. The council removed it from every tradition it controlled. The Ethiopian tradition remained outside that control, which is why the text survived. Enoch chapter 63, verse 8 uses a phrase most translations render as, "the mighty shall weep." The Ge'ez is more specific. The term is Yehezb Melektok, the rulers of the people, those who held authority over communities. And the reason they weep in the text is not described as generic wickedness. The reason given is that they see, at the gate, that their record does not match what they told the people their record would say. The Ge'ez construction here implies a specific discrepancy between the public account of what a person stood for and the actual account of what they did in private. The gate reads the actual account, not the public-facing version, the real one. And there is nowhere to object to what it says. The Western version of judgment tends toward categories of belief and sacramental participation. The Ethiopian version, drawing on the complete Enoch canon, tends toward a review of specific conduct, specific record-keeping, and treatment of truth across a lifetime. The difference is not minor and it is not abstract. It determines what you think the gate is actually measuring, and it determines what you think it means to prepare for it. The 3 Ge'ez manuscripts Bruce carried out of Ethiopia in 1773 are held at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, the Royal Library of France in Paris, and the Biblioteca Medicia Lorenziana in Florence. The judgment chapters have been translated. The criteria are in print. The 4 categories of gate examination are documented. The Mikanent, the withholders of truth, are named. The Yehezb Melektok, those who told the people one thing while the record says another, are described in Ge'ez unchanged since the manuscripts were written. The church that removed the text is still operating. The text it removed is still in the library of the church it could not control. The gate described in the Ethiopian canon is not a metaphor. It is a process. The criteria are recorded. And the one criterion the Western tradition's councils found most inconvenient to preserve is the one that most directly describes what those councils did. The soul at the threshold of Deber Mengist is not asked what it believed. It is not asked what institution it belonged to or what rituals it performed. It is asked what it did with the poor, what it did with the widow and the orphan, and it is asked what it did with truth in its time, whether it kept the record clean, whether it passed on what was real or what was convenient, whether it was a mechanant, one who held the account and chose to alter it. The examination is thorough, the record is complete. Nothing in the Gez gives the impression that anything is missing from the file being read. The soul that arrives believing its record will say one thing and finds the record says another is in the category of those who weep in chapter 63. The text does not linger, it moves on. The gate closes. And the first criterion in chapter 45, before the poor and the widow and the orphan, before any of the conduct questions, is a criterion about the elect one, recognizing those who have appealed to his glorious name. The Gez word for appealed is not the word for prayed or worshipped. It is the word for those who called on the name in the context of bearing witness to truth. To call on the name, in the Ethiopian reading, is to invoke divine authority for the purpose of truth-telling. The gate opens for those whose record shows they use the divine name in service of accurate witness. That is a standard the Church Fathers who voted in 364 CE would have had difficulty meeting, given what they were doing. And it is a standard the Ethiopian Church has taught for 1,500 years, drawn from a text that survived because Ethiopia was not in the room when the voting happened. The manuscripts are still in Axum. The gate criteria have not changed. The examination has not changed. What changed in 364 CE was what the Western world was permitted to know about them, and what the Ethiopian Bible preserved. In the section of Enoch, the church which removed it, called the book that names the measures of judgment, is the exact account of what the gate is actually measuring. That account is what you just heard. It was removed from your Bible. It stayed in theirs. And the difference between those two canons is the difference between a judgment that routes through institutional authority and a judgment that reads the record directly. The record is the test. The gate is not a door to knock on. It is a process you arrive at already documented. What you did with the poor, what you did with the vulnerable, what you did with truth in your time. The Gez has it. The Council of Laodicea knew it had it and removed it from every canon they controlled. The Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion kept it behind stone walls in Axum and has been reading it as scripture ever since. The text did not change. The criteria did not change. Only the access to it changed. For 1,500 years, most of the world has been on the wrong side of that. That is the test at the gate. That is who enters. That is what was taken from you. And that is what the Church removed.